Now, this portion is going to talk about the cardiac cycle and different changes that happen within the pressures of the blood chambers, the heart chambers. So, I would recommend at this point, if you did not take a break, that this would be a good time to take that break before you start this part. It just needs a lot of concentration. So here it goes. So the cardiac cycle means that the blood flows through the heart in a very systematic way. And because the ventricles are the bigger of the two chambers, we are going to discuss the cardiac cycle in two events. One of the events would be when the ventricles contract and eject blood out of the ventricles. That would be the period of systole. And the second part of the cycle is when the ventricles relax and start filling up with blood, and that would be the diastolic part of the cardiac cycle. And a typical heart rate ranges somewhere between 60 to 90 beats per minute, on average about 72. And that each cardiac cycle, which means that the ventricle contracts and then relaxes, that lasts about 0.8 of a second. The majority of the cycle actually happens during diastole, so only 0.3 seconds constitutes how long it takes for the ventricles to contract, while the remaining of the cycle, 0.5 seconds, so half a second, is during diastole. So these are the divisions of the cardiac cycle. Above, the part on the top represents the changes that happen during ventricular systole, while the part on the bottom represent what happens during diastole. So let's take it one step at a time. The very first part of systole is called the isovolumetric ventricular contraction. During this kind of contraction, both of the AV valves and the semilunar valves are closed. And I'm going to kind of explain this in terms of the right side of the heart, but obviously these changes also happen on the left side. But again, so the very first part is the isovolumetric ventricular contraction, where the tricuspid valve and the pulmonary valves, both of them are closed. The ventricle is going to start to contract, but the blood isn't going to go anywhere until the pressure inside of the ventricle increases, where it is now more than the pressure inside of the pulmonary artery, and that is going to open the pulmonary valve. So why is it that the tricuspid valve doesn't open? Well, that is because the chorda tendineae is being pulled and the papillary muscles pull onto the cusps, preventing that tricuspid valve from opening. So again, when the pressure inside of the right ventricle increases, that is going to overcome the pressure in the pulmonary artery, allowing for the pulmonary valve to open. And that leads us to the second portion of systole, which is ventricular ejection, which means that the ventricle now, as it contracts, is going to eject the blood that's in it into the pulmonary trunk, if we're talking in terms of the right ventricle. If we're talking in terms of the left ventricle, then the blood will be ejected into the aorta. So during ventricular ejection, we have the tricuspid and mitral valves are shut, while the semilunar valves, whether pulmonary or aortic valves, both of those are open. Now moving down to diastole, after that ejection happens, you'll find that all four valves close down again, and the ventricle starts to relax. In doing so, the pressure inside of the ventricle decreases, and until it decreases to where the atrial pressure, the pressure in the atrium is now more than the pressure in the ventricle. That is going to lead to the opening of the AV valves. So on this side, it will be the tricuspid valve, and that leads us to the stages of ventricular filling. The first part of ventricular filling is a very passive filling that pretty much happens by gravity. Just due to the opening of the AV valves, the blood is going to flow from the atria down into the ventricles. In the second part, we have atrial contraction, where the atria is going to contract and kind of squeeze the remaining part of blood that's in it down into the ventricles. So during the stage of ventricular filling, you obviously are going to have both AV valves open, the tricuspid and mitral valves, but the semilunar valves, both the pulmonary and the aortic valves, are going to be closed. So for this cycle, you want to be familiar with the pressure changes that are happening and which valves are open and which valves are closed during each of these phases. Now, knowing the different phases of cardiac cycle, we are going to go over the pressure changes that happen in the right ventricle and what happens in the pulmonary arterial pressure as well during that cardiac cycle. Let's kind of talk about what these phases are. So number 1 is the ventricular filling phase. 2 is that isovolumetric ventricular contraction when all of the valves are closed. 3 is ventricular ejection. 4 is that isovolumetric ventricular relaxation. And then that takes us back to phase 1. So these parts represents the 4 phases up here. And then we are going to record the changes that happen. First off, let's talk about the changes that happen in the right ventricle. And this is a part where hopefully you're at a point where you don't actually have to memorize these, but you are understanding how these pressures are happening. So in the phase of ventricular filling, in terms of what's going on in the right ventricle, remember that the atrium is going to be emptying its contents and then contracting. So you can see that little wave here that corresponds to the atrial contraction, that kind of increase in ventricular pressure. And then we'll go down to the isovolumetric ventricular contraction, where the ventricle is contracting with all of the valves shut. So the pressure is going to increase during that phase until the semilunar valves open and the right ventricle is now pushing or ejecting the blood into the pulmonary artery until it gets to a point where the right ventricle starts to empty and the pressure goes down, and then the pulmonary valve shuts. That will take us to the isovolumetric ejection phase, where the ventricle is going to start relaxing, and you can see the pressure going down until it goes below the pressure found in the right atrium. And again, the tricuspid valve open, and then we repeat that whole cycle all over again. Now we want to take a look at the pressure changes that are happening in the pulmonary artery. Well, basically, what is happening when the ventricles contract, when the right ventricle contracts, that's going to push blood into the pulmonary artery. And you can kind of see that happening during the phase of ventricular ejection. During everything else, the other phases, the blood is flowing away from the pulmonary artery, so the pressure in the pulmonary artery is decreasing through the rest of the phases. There's a YouTube video, that link right here, that you could watch, and it shows, in an animated video, all of these different pressure changes. So little clinical application here, kind of depending, or what is it that we're going to hear with all of this movement. There are different heart sounds. Some of them are normal, some are abnormal. So we'll talk first about the normal heart sounds. And those are your first and second heart sounds, or S1 and S2. And they correspond to the closures of the valves. So as the valves close, that is the sound that we're going to hear. So we hear a lub-dup and then pause, lub-dup and then pause. Again, it happens due to the closures of the valves, not opening of the valves. The first heart sound, that first lub that you hear, is due to the closure of the atrioventricular valves, so both the tricuspid and mitral. While the second heart sound, which is a louder dup, that happens due to the closure of the semilunar valves, which are both your pulmonary and aortic valves. So these are normal heart sounds. What about the abnormal ones? Okay, so for example, heart murmurs. Heart murmurs happen when there is an abnormal movement of blood, where there's turbulence in the bloodstream, and that we could hear that in the in the form of these different heart murmurs. Usually it happens due to abnormal heart valves. So sometimes valves are just too narrow, and we call that stenosis. Other times the valves are leaking, and we call that insufficiency. A third reason why we might hear a murmur is that if there's a hole between the two atria or a hole between the two ventricles, and that is known as a septal defect. So under normal conditions, we have this very laminar flow where the blood is flowing in a laminar, very quiet. We only hear the S1, S2. So you can see the blood flowing through the valve with no turbulence. Once there is turbulence, whether it's due to stenosis, as you can see in this valve, stenotic valve, or if it's regurgitation or incompetence, where the valve is leaking backwards, again, that turbulence in either conditions leads to what we hear. Using a stethoscope, you will hear that as a murmur. Now, a little bit about the mechanics of the heart. There is a cardiac output, heart rate, and stroke volume. So let's define what those all mean. So the heart rate is pretty much self-explanatory, which is the rate of the heart beating per minute. The cardiac output, or let's go to the stroke volume first. The stroke volume is how much blood is ejected per contraction. And then the cardiac output is the product of both of these. So if you multiply the heart rate by the stroke volume, it gives you the cardiac output. By definition, which means by definition that the cardiac output is the amount of blood that the heart is going to pump out of each ventricle per minute. And again, you want to be able to calculate it by multiplying the heart rate times the stroke volume. Under normal conditions, the cardiac output on average is about 5 liters per minute. Okay, and the stroke volume tends to be fairly constant. What happens, and the cardiac output, the body tries to maintain a constant cardiac output. So let's say, for example, that there is severe blood loss and the stroke volume is going to go down, so it declines. So again, being that the cardiac output is a product of these two, if the stroke volume goes down, what the body will do in order to maintain a constant cardiac output, it would have to increase the heart rate. Now, how does the body regulate the heart rate? We all know that the heart beats according to or under the control of the SA node. Okay, the SA node again has the automaticity. It has that inherent autonomous discharge of the SA node, which is between 60 to 90 beats per minute. It can obviously beat a little bit slower or a little bit faster, but again, because that SA node is under the influence of different hormones and different nerves, as we've already talked about, the sympathetic versus the parasympathetic. We should already know that the sympathetic stimulation to the SA node will lead to increase in heart rate, while the parasympathetic stimulation to the heart would lead to a decrease in heart rate. And remember that those parasympathetic fibers reach the heart through the vagus. And we call these different changes that happen, we call these the chronotropic effect. And here you can see kind of in a table, which is really nice, the effects of the sympathetic versus the parasympathetic nervous system on the cardiac muscles. Remember, the sympathetic nerves are norepinephrine secreting neurons, and they stimulate the beta adrenergic receptors on the heart. The sympathetic system innervates or can stimulate the SA node, AV node, atrium, and ventricular muscles, so pretty much everything in the heart, and it will lead to increase in everything. So it'll increase heart rate, it'll stimulate the AV node to increase the conduction rate from the atrium down to the ventricles. It'll stimulate the atrial and ventricular muscle fibers to increase their force and increase their contractility, so increasing the force of contraction. The parasympathetic nerves, on the other hand, those fibers were cholinergic fibers, so they release acetylcholine as their neurotransmitter, And the receptors on the heart were muscarinic cholinergic receptors. Remember, parasympathetic does innervate the SA node, AV node, and the atrium a little bit, but there are no parasympathetic fibers reaching the ventricles. As for what kind of effect it performs, well, on the SA node, it's going to decrease heart rate, so it leads to bradycardia. AV node, it will decrease the conduction rates of that action potential going from the atrium down to the ventricle, and it will decrease the contractility, decrease the force of contraction of the atria. Remember, it really has no effect on the ventricles. The effect on the ventricle will be kind of an indirect effect because it decreased the overall heart rate, so that is obviously going to affect the ventricular heart rate, the ventricular rate as well. But there's no direct significant action in meaning that it doesn't really change the force of contraction of the ventricles. And here you can see how the mechanism of the sympathetic nervous system, how it affects the cardiac muscles. It's all due to the stimulation of that beta-adrenergic receptor, leading to the stimulation of the adenylyl cyclase enzyme, which increases your cyclic AMP. So it mediates it through the increase of the second messenger. We already know what stroke volume is, which is the volume of blood that is ejected out of the ventricle with each contraction. And another way to calculate the stroke volume would be the difference between, and I'll name them and then I will explain what these mean. The stroke volume is the difference between the end-diastolic volume and the end-systolic volume. So the end-diastolic volume means the amount of blood, or the volume of blood found in the ventricles at the end of diastole. So the end-diastolic volume. When you subtract from it the end-systolic volume, which is the volume of blood remaining in the ventricle after a contraction, after the systole, so the end-systolic volume, that will give you the stroke volume. So I'll just give you an example, and these are very hypothetical numbers. Okay, so let's say that the right ventricle fills up with blood, and at the end of diastole, it's at about 100 milliliters. And then when it contracts, you measure the amount of blood that remains after the contraction, and you find it to be 25 milliliters. That means that the stroke volume, if you subtract those, that means that the stroke volume was 75 milliliters, which is about 75%. Okay, so these are just numbers that I kind of made up. Okay, the typical stroke volume in a resting individual, so at rest, is about 70 milliliters per beat. Okay, so again, it's the difference between the end-diastolic minus the end-systolic volume. So what are the three factors that can change or dominate the stroke volume? Well, obviously these two, so changes in these two, changes in the end-diastolic volume. Okay, if you have a bigger diastolic volume versus a smaller one, and how that can affect the stroke volume. So let's take a look at how it would affect your stroke volume. The end-diastolic volume really depends on how much blood returns to the ventricle, which means it depends on the venous return to the right atrium. So again, if you get more venous return to the right atrium, that means you'll eventually fill up the right ventricle with more blood, and that increases the end-diastolic volume. That is known as an increase in the preload of the heart. So you have increased the venous return, increasing its preload. When the amount of blood in the ventricles increases, that stretches the ventricles, and that stretch, and we'll talk about that, I believe, maybe in the next slide or two, that stretching the ventricles increases the force of contraction. So an increase in your end-diastolic volume will eventually increase the stroke volume due to increase in the force of contraction. The stroke volume is also dependent on the afterload. So the afterload is basically the amount of pressure found in the artery after the ventricle. So in the case of the right ventricle, the afterload would be how much pressure is there in the pulmonary trunk that the right ventricle would have to overcome in order to empty its contents. So any change in the afterload, which again is the arterial pressure against which the ventricles are going to contract. The stroke volume is also dependent on the magnitude of the sympathetic nervous system input into the ventricles. And that takes us to the Frank-Starling law, also known as the Starling's law of the heart. So when we mentioned that the stretch, the increase in the end-diastolic volume stretches the cardiac muscle fibers, and it's kind of like a rubber band where you stretch it, and then if you release, it will, go back into its original position to a limit. Okay, so that's kind of like what the heart does as well. So the more you stretch the cardiac muscles, the stronger the force of contraction, but again, it's up to a limit. So at any given heart rate, if you increase the venous return, that means you're increasing your end diastolic volume, or you can also say it in other words, you're increasing your preload of the heart. Now you're stretching these heart muscles. That is going to lead to an increase in cardiac output due to the increase in that end diastolic volume, increasing the force of contraction and increasing your stroke volume. And this graph shows you that relationship where we're plotting the end diastolic volume against the stroke volume. So you see that as the end diastolic volume increases, the stroke volume is also increasing with it, but again, up to a limit. So there's a limit. If you overstretch the cardiac muscles, that is going to lead to failure of the muscle fibers. And you can see here that the stroke volume can no longer increase. Now, what is the ejection fraction? So the ejection fraction is a ratio between the stroke volume and the end diastolic volume. So it's really not a number. It is a ratio between how much did I eject out of how much was actually the total of what was in that ventricle. So again, using kind of those same numbers where the end diastolic volume was about 100 milliliters and the stroke volume was about 75. So that means that the ejection fraction in this case would be about 75%. 75%. So your ejection fraction again would be the ratio between the stroke volume and the end diastolic volume. So it's a percentage. Okay, on average, if for healthy hearts under resting conditions, the ejection fraction should range somewhere between 50 to 75%. Okay, decreases in ejection fraction, that tends to mean that the heart is failing. It is no longer able to eject as much blood as it should per contraction. Any increase in contractility, so increase in the force of contraction, will lead to an increase in that ejection fraction. Now, what is the afterload, and how does the afterload affect the stroke volume? We already kind of talked about it a little bit. The afterload, just kind of like any other muscle. So think about your skeletal muscle fiber when you want to carry a weight. That weight is considered the load that the skeletal muscle has to overcome. Well, in the terms of the heart, the load that it has to overcome would be the pressure in the artery. That's known again as the afterload. So any increase in the arterial pressure is going to reduce the stroke volume because it's harder for the heart now to contract against that high arterial pressure. So that arterial pressure is the load when we're talking about the heart. So in terms of afterload, the greater the load, which meaning the higher the pressure, the less contracting muscle fibers can shorten at a given contractilities, which basically means that it is harder for the muscle fibers to contract against this very high load. And that ends this portion.